Okay, Monday, April 4th, 2022. It's been a long time since I shot one of these. I thought I had stopped the YouTube channel, but maybe I'll start it back up with this video. This will be number 135 or something like that, I don't know. So I've been thinking about the relationship between understanding myself and the meaning of life. Big subjects, but I wanted to throw out some ideas really fast. So I've been saying this for a while now. I think the whole point of I think that the uniting factor between the thought process on the left and the right is the understanding of ourselves. So when I say understand myself, I mean me specifically, but I also mean us as a group, as a society. So when Americans say, what should we do next? First, we have to understand where are we right now, right? We can't make a plan as a country unless we understand ourselves as a country. So a large part of the political discussion is an argument over what exactly we are. Who are we? What are we doing right now? Where are we right now? Sort of metaphysically, right? So that's the understanding ourselves part. And then you have to think about the meaning. So if at any point you were to stop yourself, if I was to stop myself in the middle of constructing, so right now what I'm currently doing is installing a second sink. I'm installing a kitchen sink in this house. So I'm in the crawl space running some new plumbing. And if at any moment you were to stop me and ask me, what are you doing? Right? So I could say, well, I'm hanging up this pipe hanger so that I can run a pipe from this spot to this spot so that water can drain out. And then you ask me again, why? What are you doing? And it's okay. Rather than giving you a specific physical answer, right? Like, oh, I'm currently turning it. Like, there's levels of specificity, right? I could be very specific. I could say, I'm currently turning a screw into some wood in order to hang up a pipe hanger, right? So there's a level of specificity, and then it can expand upwards. It can be, all right, I'm turning the screw, which means I'm trying to hang this pipe, which means that I'm doing that so that I can install an overall length of pipe with a bunch of twists and turns from a sink to the septic tank. And then, so why am I doing that? I'm doing that so that I can have a sink in the kitchen. So what I'm doing is I'm installing a kitchen sink. Even though I'm in a crawl space, currently twisting a screw into a piece of wood, if you were to just take a snapshot of that, you wouldn't necessarily understand that I'm installing a kitchen sink, but that's what I'm doing. And then the tricky part is that it can get bigger than that. So it's not just that I'm installing a kitchen sink, I'm fixing a house, right? So if you just saw me installing a sink, you don't necessarily know that I'm in the act of working on a fixer-upper house right now. And then you have to ask the question again, why am I doing this on this house? And that's where it gets very complex. That's where you start to get to these big questions, like, why am I even here working on this house doing anything? And so I can sit here and try and answer that question, but it gets harder and harder to answer the farther out you go. Because eventually, the specificity, or whatever you want to call it, you reach a level of abstraction that's essentially like, why am I doing anything in life? Why do I need to do anything in life? Do I need an answer to that question? When somebody asks me, what are you doing at any one moment, do I need to be able to answer it all the way up to the top? You would think that eventually there would be a single point at the top. There'd be that single guiding star. That single thing that would answer, that would always be the thing you would fall back onto. And I think that that's the hard question to answer. That's the hardest question to answer. So if you were to ask me, what's the guiding star at the top? If you keep asking me, why am I doing, what am I doing? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Where are you right now? Where are you going? Why do you think you're here right now? Why do you think you want to head in that direction? And so there's this, if you truly understood yourself, you would be able to answer that question. You'd be able to answer it at any level of specificity. You could say, this is my guiding star, this is my plan for until I die, basically. Like, this is my meaning in life. This is what I'm doing today, tomorrow, next week, next year, 10 years from now. You would have it all not planned out specifically, but you'd have a compass in your hand that would always tell you which direction to go, metaphysically speaking. Always. The compass, that meaning, right? How do you know? That's a problem for me as an individual, but it's also a problem for us as a society. Wow. As a society. Look what happened here. My path is blocked. We've had a couple very windy days in the past few days, so it looks like I'll come back and clear this out. Anyway, so I've been trying to get myself ready to possibly move back to California. Possibly. I might give up on this house and reset my life back to where it was 2 or 3 years ago. Pre-pandemic me is probably the goal I would try to shoot for. I'm trying to get back to 2019 me, but with more experience. Without more money, but more experience. If I go back there, I'm going to be caught up in political conversations with people on the left, as I was before. And it's not something I can avoid. It's something that will happen. So the arguments are playing out in my head, and so I need to have a way of handling these conflicts, these confrontations, in a peaceful way. And I know that I don't have I can get along with the vast majority of people that have political beliefs different from mine. But I can't stop myself when I meet somebody who I consider a true believer in some left-wing ideas. I can't really stop myself from poking at them, from playing with them a little bit, kind of jabbing them in the side or flicking them in the ear a little bit, you know what I mean? So I need to come at it from the position that I sort of described in the previous 8 minutes here, which is that what on an abstract level are we trying to do, right? So I think whether you're on the left or the right, on the one common ground we have is that we are trying to understand ourselves. It's really about understanding ourselves. So a lot of the ideas you find under the category of wokeness, whether it's transgender stuff or racial stuff or feminism or any of this, it's usually based on if I was going to have a conversation with these people, that's where I'd have to start, is what is your understanding of us? So if somebody's a feminist, you could ask them a question like, does feminism exist without men? I think that that's a good starting point, because that's not a question that would necessarily trigger somebody's political, behavioral immune system, you know? It wouldn't trigger the psychological affect that happens when you say, hey, what about Trump, or what about abortion or something, right? If I say, does feminism exist without men, I think somebody can actually engage that idea honestly without freaking out, without becoming emotional. So I think I'd start with that for feminism, because I know I always come back to this, but this is what the left focuses on, you know, and this is what I'm going to run into. I'm going to run into these people. So I just asked the question, does feminism exist without men? And I can't think of a way that anybody would answer that question yes. The answer to that question is no. Does feminism exist without men? No, it doesn't. If the world was only female, there'd be no such thing as feminism. Which, now you have to get to the definition of feminism. If you define feminism in a way that makes it so that feminism exists in a world of only females, then you just can't, I'm not going to go down that pathway. I think that you basically have to go down the pathway of feminism exists because men exist, which means feminism truly is not the understanding of women. It's the understanding of ourselves. It's not the understanding of men or women. It's the understanding of us, ourselves. It's that same thing. It's like there's a feminist understanding of us, of history, of the world as it is today, as it was, as it will be. Feminism provides a compass, right? It has an answer for where are we, how do we go to the next place. And so you start with this question, does feminism exist without men? And then I can say, okay, so feminism is about the relationship between men and women. Really, it's about the world of men and women. It's both. It can't exist with only one or the other. Both have to be part of the understanding. And then you ask the next question, which I think is where this now splits the religious versus the non-religious realm of feminism, right? Once you ask, can feminism exist without men? The answer is no. Then you have to ask, what's the difference between men and women? How can we possibly understand the relationship between men and women if we cannot describe both of them accurately? And so some branch of feminists will say there is no difference between men and women. That the only differences that exist between us, maybe beyond the physical, maybe you can get them to accept that there are physical differences. I mean, some of them will say some almost ridiculously willfully blind things, right, by saying, no, there are no physical differences. But most will acknowledge physical differences and then deny emotional, behavioral differences. But that makes them religious, because now they're denying. They're no longer following the science. They're no longer... Let me slow down here. So you ask the question, feminism exists without men? No. Okay, what are the differences between men and women? Now, they're either going to give you a religious answer that just denies the fact that there are any behavioral differences, in which case you're now having an argument over the animals that we are. It's still an argument over who are we. It's still about understanding us. But now, in order to deny behavioral, emotional differences between men and women, you have to deny evolution. And so now you're in an argument about evolution. So, and that's a place I'm very comfortable. Very comfortable. I've been arguing with creationists since I was 14. So, had an argument with a creationist 2 nights ago. The world is 6,000 years old and God created all of us with the, So if that person takes that stance, then sure, they can. The only way to take the stance where there's no difference between men and women, physical differences, behavioral, emotional, physical differences, is if you do not take the Darwinian story to be truth. So that places them in a bad spot, I think. So yeah, you can break this into 4 possibilities here now. First question, is there a difference, or is there feminism without men? If they answer no, you say, okay, what are the differences between men and women? Are there differences between men and women? If they say no, they are now in a creationist, it's like the combination of creationism and wokeism somehow. But if they say yes, there are differences, physical, behavioral, emotional, real differences between men and women, now they have to say trans women are not actually women, which makes them a TERF. So they're the kind of feminism, that's the kind of feminism that lands in TERF land, which is, I think, the correct, it's where society will eventually end up. They're going to finally end up in this quarter of the world here. Because, well, think about it. Think about it, that's how it goes. Which means trans women aren't women, which is like that is the sacred, those are the sacred words. Trans women are women that's why it's so contentious. And it all comes down to understanding us and understanding what we're doing, where we're going, what's the meaning of life. You can't answer what's the meaning of life. And also, if you're talking to somebody about what the meaning of life is and they think a trans woman's a woman, that puts them outside of this category that I've just described. You're talking to a creationist, or you're talking to somebody who is confused in some way, in a way that is similar to how a religious person is confused. And you can see the same thing, like if you look back at Galileo, he was somebody who said, hey, the planet's blah, 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 and he was thrown in prison. He was tortured and lived a horrible life by people who were religious. And it's the same thing today. It's not like as bad as what happened to Galileo, but you'll be ostracized from society. If I go back to Los Angeles and I go to the wrong group of people and I say, hey, I don't think a trans woman's a woman, I will be kicked out. And it's not as bad as Galileo, but I'm being kicked out by people who are confused in the same way religious people are confused. So then what's interesting, and this is why I think all this stuff, this is what has been driving me. I genuinely attempted to understand all of this. I have listened to all of the people I should be listening to. I've talked to people who are informed on this. One of the things that everybody always told me is that I don't understand it, that I'm close, almost there, I need to read more, listen more, think more. Some people say I'll never understand it because I'm a white guy, which is what I'm about to get to, but I think that it's just the same thing as somebody saying, oh, you don't, it's the same thing as people who say, oh, Jesus is everywhere. You'll know Jesus when you know Jesus, right? You can get close, but you kind of don't know it till you know it. It's just there's a leap of faith taken, and you can see that once you compare feminism to racism, which is where I'm about to go. So, feminism can't exist without men. Can racism exist without 2 races at least, right? If I'm just looking at the US, white and black, right? I know that there's a billion races or whatever, but if I were to say something along the lines of, and this is as hypothetical as the world without men, if I were to say, what happens if all the white people are gone? racism would be gone, right? Or white supremacy would be gone, at least. It's a little trickier than the feminism question. Does feminism exist without men? I think the answer is clearly no. Does racism exist without different kinds of races? Like, if there was only one race on the planet, if I were to snap my fingers, only black people are alive. Only black people on the planet. Every other race, gone. Disappeared from history, from everything. Like Thanos snap, whatever you want to call it. Hypothetically, if I just created only the black race, right? If black is a race, then we get into questions of what does race mean, and that's why this is such a... If I were to create a world with only one race, there'd be no racism. That's the thing. If there was a world where one race existed, there'd be no racism. So, racism, it's not the same thing as feminism, right? It's not the same, though the ISM doesn't mean the same thing, but the political movements around race and racism would not exist in a world with only one race. So, the study and the implementation of policies around race and racism necessarily require that more than one race exists. In the same way that feminism requires that men exist. So feminism is more of the study of the relationship between men and women. Race studies, whatever you want to call that, is the study of the relationship between races. So, I haven't really thought this one through, but here we go. If you were to ask somebody, all right, one race, is there racism with only one race? The answer is no. There's no more racism. You might be able to argue that there's such thing as systemic racism with no more race, because if it was the Thanos snap kind of situation, there'd still be structures that were set up, but I don't know how that would work out if there was, it's hard to imagine a world with, snap your fingers, only black people, but imagine that different races never evolved. Humans never split up into different groups evolutionarily and never developed different facial structures and skin colors and things. You can imagine that world, there'd be no racism. It'd be impossible. There'd probably be other ways people would discriminate or whatever against each other. Eye color, hair color, who knows. But the point is, what are the people on the left, when they try to understand the world and they look at it through a lens of race and racism, what question can you ask that would get at the heart of what they're thinking about? And so I think the first question I would ask is, if I were to remove all of the white people from the United States, what would happen to racism? Does it continue to exist? I mean, there'd still be multiple racial groups, but maybe that's not a good question. Honestly, the hardest part is that the definition of racism is not good. It's not, I think that's such a complex subject, because there are differences. You're going to come down to I don't know what the first question would be, but the second question, same way that you ask, what's the difference between men and women? Are there differences, and what are they between men and women? And then so you have to ask the same question, are there differences between white and black people, or between any two groups? Are there differences? And what are they? And you have to answer, again, this comes down to the religious, right? You have to answer honestly. There are differences. I mean, we can see them. They're immediately obvious to everybody. You can usually, 9 out of 10 times, I would guess, be able to categorize a person's race based off of seeing an image of them for 1 second. So, there are clearly differences. So I think the question is, to what extent do these differences manifest themselves? Are they purely physical, or are they emotional, behavioral as well? The same way between men and women. Are there behavioral differences between men and women? And then you have to ask the question, are there behavioral differences between white and black, Asian and Jewish, and Mexican and everything? All of the flavors, you know? Are there behavioral differences between our groups? And yet again, if you're talking to somebody who's going to take a creationist standpoint, they're going to say, no, of course not, because evolution doesn't exist. But if you're talking to somebody who accepts Darwinian story, that evolution exists, then you have to realize the reason that our skin looks different, the reason that we have all of these immediate physical differences that you can see in our hair, our eye color, our skin, and even across our entire bodies. There's little differences everywhere with earlobes and, you know, proportion of your, all sorts of things. All sorts of things are different. And I'm sure that if we did complex, large-scale studies, we'd find thousands of differences across our bodies, because the populations of humans have been isolated from each other long enough that we've evolved differently. And it would be crazy, I think, to assume that this had no effect on our behavior, that there are behavioral differences between different races. So if you believe that, if you think that that's true, I mean, if we look at the history of human evolution, tens of thousands of years of separation has occurred, and that's not very long in evolutionary time, but it's clearly enough time for skin color to change. So I don't think the question is, do the differences exist? I think the question is, what are they, and do they have an effect on your quote-unquote success in the world, whatever you want to call it? What if there was some set of behavioral differences that existed between two racial groups that made one more likely to succeed at whatever? What if one racial group is more likely to behave a certain way? Maybe it's interesting, you can ask the question of individuals, and you can ask it of societies. What if one group gets along better or worse, or behaves differently in a group of 100 versus 1,000 or 10,000, right? Like there's these, I mean, it's already incredible that humans can do anything at the scale of millions. It's amazing to me that, it should be amazing to anybody that you can identify yourself in a group that contains millions of other humans. That's nothing, no other animal can do that other than probably bees or something, right? Creatures that form hives. We identify ourselves in large groups, and it seems to me that being isolated, well, I've talked about this in other videos, but I've taken those videos down. There's just questions about race that people take the religious view that there are zero differences between races other than skin and hair and whatever. There seems to be an idea that the correct position ethically right now is that, yes, while there are physical differences between the races, there aren't any noticeable differences in behavior, intelligence, emotional stability, whatever you want to call it, right? There's all sorts of different ways that you can look at this, different levels. I mean, our experiences as animals, as humans, is defined by our animal bodies, right? There's only, I don't want to go too much into detail on this one because I did this in another video. Point is, I'm going to talk to somebody in Los Angeles and they're going to tell me that, oh, you're white, so you have white privilege. You benefit from a system of racism. And if I'm talking to somebody who's black, they can say that they are the opposite of benefiting. They're victimized by a system of racism. And, well, when people tell me that kind of thing, it is exactly the same as the people who used to tell me that my immortal soul was going to go to hell, or that I had to accept Jesus to be saved, or like they are, in my opinion, basing their thinking on the same level of reason, really. So, but it's so much harder to attack than it is to attack religious people. Attack's a weird word, but it's, why is it so much harder to challenge somebody on race than it is on Jesus? Even though they're both basing their claims off the same rationale, in my opinion, the same equivalent levels of rationality. You have to deny evolution either way. I really think that this whole Darwin throws a gigantic grenade into Christian thinking as well as it does into feminist and racial thinking, especially the transgender and LGBT world, especially there, because here's another question. All right, let's say I'm in Los Angeles. So we've gone through feminism, racism. Somebody's talking about how we need to be more accepting of the gay community. LGBT rights are human rights, blah, 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 right? You're running into one of those people, one of these pride people wearing a rainbow flag. Here's a question. Why does gay exist? Why is there such thing as homosexual anything? Why is there this state of human experience that you could be sexually attracted to the same sex? Why does that exist? I don't think that anybody knows the answer to that question. I've never heard a convincing answer to that question from anybody. I don't think anybody knows why it exists. So, yeah, I'm in LA, somebody gives me shit about LGBT. What do I say? I say, why does gay exist? Can they answer that? From an evolutionary perspective, no. It's not really clear. I've heard evolutionary biologists try to answer it. Maybe gay exists as a way to take care of issues at a population level, but then we have to get into conversations about population level evolution, and well, I haven't seen a convincing answer to that, so I would assume that the answer doesn't exist yet, maybe ever. So in this conversation, you ask, why does gay exist? Then you have to say, okay, well, we don't know. We don't know. We do not know. So, if we don't know why it exists, how can we say that it's good or bad? How can we say that we should accept it or not accept it? What does that even mean? It's not clear to me that it can be defined as good or bad. It's not clear to me that so-called homophobia didn't exist for a good reason. You know, there's all these rules in society that maybe we don't understand why they exist, but they do. If you think about the way that I was thinking about this. The way that we eat together. It's rude to go to somebody's house and have dinner with them, and then they serve you a plate of food. It's considered inappropriate to not eat that food. So if you're over at somebody's house and there's 4 or 5 of you or whatever, you're sitting at the dinner table, and there are plates passed around with food on it. Maybe you're visiting somebody's family, right? It's just you're the outsider visiting somebody's group. They serve you food. Even if you look down and you find it unappetizing, even if you don't want to eat it, it's rude to not eat it. And it would be really weird, you can imagine, if they decided to eat anyway, and then you're just sitting there not eating while the 3 of them or the 4 of them eat. That would be strange. It would feel odd. the experience of it would be odd. And why is that? Is that built into us culturally? Are there rules that are there that maybe aren't necessarily articulated, but are felt? And do we feel those because we were raised to feel those, or because we were born feeling those? And I would take the stance that it's both. There's a combination of two things. There's a biological layer and a social layer. And so, why did homophobia ever exist? Why? And what are we doing by taking that feeling of homophobia? What even is that? Is there a feeling of disgust that happens when you think or see homosexual behavior? Maybe there is. It definitely triggers a different feeling than seeing heterosexual behavior, right? Wouldn't it? I don't know. I mean, we only see heterosexual representation across almost every media for a long time, at least the vast majority of it. So I don't think that that's by accident. I think that there are biological reasons for that. I do. And until we can answer why gay exists, I don't think we should be so eager to make it so prevalent, to make it such a important topic. It might be good to reserve our judgment on it for a while until we have a better understanding of ourselves biologically. If you just think about the question, and I've talked about this in previous videos to no end, what even is attraction? What does it mean to feel sexually attracted? How do you even conceptualize that experience? I mean, most of us, I would say all of us, have felt that at some point, but you couldn't really write down what it is. You couldn't really. It's so deep in the biological layer. It's so far away from the rational understanding. It was there before language developed, right? Like, it was before we woke up and had the ability to speak. We were having sexual feelings. So an animal can't describe their sexual desires, and I don't think we can either. We can come up with close to good explanations, but we're never quite on it. So if we can't even understand heterosexual attraction, really, at a deep level, then we really don't understand homosexual attraction. So, again, it's just not so obvious to me that without a good understanding, that we should be doing some of the things that the people on the left are doing, which is teaching that it's normal and that it's acceptable and that we should encourage it. And I mean, I know that I'm paying attention to some, I have seen the Libs of TikTok Twitter account. Like, I know that I'm looking at extreme examples, but we have cases of people who are true believers, deep in the woke ideology, are teaching some things about sex and sexuality that are just not backed up by any evolutionary thinking, that's for sure. Anything it's based on, again, the same leap of faith that you would have to take if you believed in Jesus saving your immortal soul. If you question these people deep enough, why, you get to the bottom of their ideology, they'll come to the same layer that I described at the beginning of this video with the feminism, right? Where they're going to have to take a choice at some point between the understanding of us as animals in a Darwinian sense and some kind of leap of faith, right? That's why this transgender thing is so important. It's because, there is a difference between men and women, and maybe that's why homophobia exists. Maybe if you have a society too accepting of gay behavior, you're going to have a not good society. Maybe that's why that feeling exists, or that's why homophobia is there. It's not just a social construct. It's there to prevent us from becoming something. I don't know. It's a feeling I get as somebody who has spent quite a bit of time deep in that crowd. I'm gonna go ahead and tell you that it's not necessarily aimed in a good direction all of the time. I mean, I know not every group is, but if you want to experience degeneracy, if you want to experience hedonism, things where if you were the leader of a country, what would you want your country to be doing? Obviously, you want them to have some rest and relaxation. You want them to party once in a while, let off some steam, but you also want them building things and making the world a better place for themselves and for their children. And I've seen, maybe Well, we just need to be willing to ask some questions. Do we really want a world where it depends. What world do we want to head in? We have to understand ourselves before we can understand where we want to go. What world do we want to live in? And the world that these people seem to be building towards completely denies the fact that human beings even have bodies, really, biological, physical material here. There seems to be like a transhumanist, if I could understand it, maybe if I can take their side, if I could be optimistic about where they want to go, it's that we are entering an age where physical work is not as necessary, where you could, if you're born in a certain place with a certain environment, you are becoming more and more separated from the physical world. Most people don't ever have to install a sink. If your sink breaks, you don't physically interact with it in any way. You press a button on your phone, talk to your landlord talks to a plumber comes over, does everything. You want food. You don't necessarily need to make food. You don't need to touch food with your hands and prepare it physically. You can just press a button, food shows up at your door. So we're becoming more and more disconnected from the physical world. Like if you live, this is the creationist that I talked to 2 days ago. He has to, during the summer, the spring and the summer and the fall, he has to prepare for the winter by chopping wood. He's got a big spot where he chops up wood to stack it up so that during the winter he can burn wood in his wood stove so that he can not freeze to death during the winter. That's how he generates heat. And there's, that's an old school way of doing it, but it requires physical interaction with the environment at a lot of levels. Like you have to go into the woods, you have to find a tree that fell down, like right here, or you have to go chop one down. You got to chop it up into pieces, which means, you got to get out there with a car or some sort of vehicle or a wheelbarrow or something. You have to interact with the physical world, take pieces of physical objects, put them in a container, move them back to your house, stack them up, throw them in a fire. There's a lot of different problems to deal with here, right? Maybe your stove breaks, there's gas escaping. You don't necessarily these people don't call a plumber, they fix it themselves. So the old school is more attached to the physical, and the new school is becoming more detached. And I'm not going to say that's a bad thing, but we're just headed towards more and more of a abstract realm, abstracted away from the physical. So people that live their entire lives in sort of I think the people that are more willing to accept a lot of these things about feminism, racism, and LGBT and all this are people who are less connected to the physical world. Like if you talk to people who are tradespeople who work with their hands building and fixing things, and if you talk to, I think this applies to chefs and people who deal with food, and also people who work in the medical world, police officers. If you look at where people who are more conservative tend to work versus people who are more liberal, right? If you think about liberal, left-leaning, usually more thought work, knowledge work, writers, actors. I mean, that's a generalization, but people that work in education, that work in academia, research, that work on software, that work on, internet tools and things. A lot of that, you're abstracting away from the physical world. And so it makes I think there's less resistance to these ideas that there really are such thing as trans women and all that stuff. And so in a sense, they're headed in a great direction, because you get to that question, there's that sort of philosophical question. If you were born in a machine that just simulated happiness for you for 80 to 100 years, and you never knew that you were in that machine, wouldn't that be what you want, right? If there was just a way to be perfectly in bliss for your entire existence, from beginning to end, that would be, it's hard to say that you wouldn't want that, right? Wouldn't everybody you get into conversations about, it's just, the direction this is headed in is basically a world where you have almost no interaction with the physical. where you're almost born into something Matrix-esque, where your entire life is just, I mean, who's to say we're even going to need to chew food at a certain point, or take a dump, or, I mean, we're already having less sex, right? So, and sex is physical. There's just a detachment from the physical that we seem to be headed towards with all our technological progress and everything. And, well, all right. I think I should end it on that note, because then I just start talking about the future of technology, and that just inevitably leads to a conversation I don't want to get into right now. So, yeah, today's April 4th, 2022. I guess I'll post this, and it'll look like the first video because I've taken down all my previous ones. So, yep, bye.